Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. We'll begin with the world lead. It has been something of a challenge piecing together the events leading up to the capture of newly freed American captive Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl, thanks in no small part to the military's clampdown on information from that night and the following weeks. But now CNN has uncovered some remarkable new claims from local Afghan officials, not just about Bergdahl's capture, but about his actions in the moments beforehand. Our Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr joins us now. Barbara, explain, what are these local villagers telling us?
Well, Jake, I think it's important what you just not independently verify any of this, but a local Afghan security official who was on duty when in the area when Bergdahl was captured is telling CNN Bergdahl apparently wandered into a village. The Afghan villagers tried to tell him apparently it was too dangerous, he shouldn't be there, that he should return to his base. But they had language difficulties. Nobody understood each other. There is also a report he was on hallucinogenic drugs. We want to say again that we have not been able to confirm that. But apparently what did happen is that at some point, of course, the Taliban in the area grabbed him and took him into captivity. This is part of the narrative, and it is very difficult now to piece together exactly what happened.
And Barbara, what have you learned about Bergdahl's actions while being held by the Taliban over the previous 5 years?
Actually, a U.S. official is now telling me that they do have information that Bergdahl may have tried to escape at least twice during his 5 years in captivity. The reason this official is caveating that with a may, they have some information, some intelligence about this, but they really do need to talk to Bowe Bergdahl and get from him the direct details of what happened. A lot of this, Jake, awaits talking to Bowe Bergdahl directly.
Barbara Starr at the Pentagon, thank you so much. These new claims are emerging after senators got a closed-door look at that proof-of-life video of Bergdahl, which apparently showed the captive in such a state the White House decided to cut a deal immediately to swap the sergeant for 5 mid to high-ranking Taliban imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay. They did so, of course, without notifying Congress as required by law. Senator Angus King, independent of Maine, tells CNN that in the briefing last night, he and his fellow senators were told that U.S. intelligence indicated that if anything about the swap became public before it went down, Bergdahl would have been killed. President Obama in Belgium today said the political uproar over Bergdahl's release does not make him waver in the slightest about whether the swap was the right thing to do.
I'm never surprised by controversies that are whipped up in Washington. We do not leave anybody wearing the American uniform behind. We had a prisoner of war whose health had deteriorated, and we were deeply concerned about, and we saw an opportunity and we seized it, and I make no apologies for that.
After that private briefing and the screening of that proof-of-life video, the senators, most of whom I think it's fair to say are not medical doctors, they emerged with widely ranging takes on what they saw.
I don't think from a health standpoint there was any issue.
He looked terrible, and I think that video should be released at some point.
That did not sell me at all. The proof of life was based 5 months ago, December. At that time, he was impaired. That is not the person that was released here.
The tape in question is one of 2 proof-of-life videos released of Bergdahl recently, neither of which has been made public yet. Very few Americans can relate to the experience of enduring 5 years as a prisoner of war. Senator John McCain is a noble exception, but he also happens to be one of the leading Republicans criticizing the deal that the White House cut with the Taliban to get Bergdahl home in exchange for 5 Guantanamo Bay detainees. And Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona and ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, joins me now. Senator, I know you want to talk about this. In February, you had some comments to Anderson Cooper about this case, and I want to run those and get your response.
Would you oppose the idea of some form of negotiations or prisoner exchange? I know back in 2012 you called the idea of even negotiating with the Taliban bizarre, highly questionable.
Well, at that time, the proposal was that they would release Taliban, some of them really hardcore, particularly 5 really hardcore Taliban leaders, as a confidence-building measure. Now this idea is for an exchange of prisoners for our American fighting man. I would be inclined to support such a thing, depending on a lot of the details.
So you sound supportive, inclined to support such a thing, depending on some of the details.
Yeah, and the details are outrageous. The details are that they went to Qatar, where the Taliban has an office, and in a year they're going to be out, and the deal is, it's like any other agreement. It's, as I said, it's in the details. And so I mean, it's just totally unacceptable. These people would be back in the fight. Our troops will still be there. And it's like any other. I support a lot of agreements. I support an agreement with Iran on nuclear situation, but I certainly would want to know the details. And right now, the details I know are not any good. The details, as I found out here, were unacceptable.
So if given this choice, if you were in the White House, or if they'd come to you and given you the decision and said, we're concerned about Bergdahl, this is our chance, 5 Taliban for him, you would say no?
Absolutely. Look, first of all, before I consider it, and who those Taliban were, these are people that were selected by the Taliban, not by the United States to start with. Second of all, they're the highest ranking people. Third of all, they were judged to be such a risk that they shouldn't be released. And fourth of all, they are released into Qatar, where they are free to travel and plot, and also after a year, there's no doubt in my mind they will re-enter the fight.
But
That's why Leon Panetta said what he said, that he opposed it.
But Senator, presumably this was the best deal they could get. You're saying that if you
that's like saying a nuclear deal with Iran is the best deal they can get. It has to be a deal that preserves American security.
So he would still be in Pakistan or Afghanistan or wherever he was?
I'm afraid that that's the case, because our first obligation is not to put the lives of American fighting men and women at risk by having these people return to the fight. There's a clear record of these people having returned to the fight and in leadership positions, because it's a badge of honor to have been in Guantanamo. These are also war criminals. A couple of them were accused of killing thousands of Shiite Muslims. These are the ones that used to take women into the soccer stadium at Kabul and hang them from the goalpost. I would certainly not want to release anyone that would pose a risk of further threat to the United States of America.
And Senator, they're not going to free members who are members of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I mean, it's going to be bad guys that are released in exchange for an American.
There's all kinds of people. This is the top leadership selected by the Taliban. There is a huge difference, Jake. Look, this is just an attack by the Obama files. Look, I would never agree to such a thing, and I said I would have to know, depending on the details.
Okay.
And then I went on and said again, after asked, I obviously would have to know the details, okay?
Got it.
The details are unacceptable, and for anyone to accuse me, therefore, of saying I'd support any prisoner swap under any circumstances is lying.
Let's move on. You saw the tape, the tape last night, the proof of life tape. How did Bergdahl look in that tape to you, and why do you think so many senators have different opinions on his health?
Well, I can't. I'm not that. I don't have that kind of expertise. I do know that Dr. Coburn. Well, I shouldn't say. Why don't you ask Dr. Coburn what his view of it is, because he's a qualified medical doctor and he observed it rather than me. That also, I understand that video was taken back in January. That's a long time since then has elapsed. So,
but what was your take on it?
Well, I think he looked a little strange to me. It was hard to tell. It was very brief. It was up close. I don't expect anybody who's been being held in prison to look like they're in great shape, to tell you the truth, Jake.
As a former prisoner of war, and I'm not comparing you and Sergeant Bergdahl, obviously very different situations, very different captivities, but as a former prisoner of war, did you see anything in his eyes, either in the proof of life or in his release, that you could relate to, that you could understand, just because you're one of the few people who has this kind of, unfortunately, you have this kind of expertise?
I recall a couple of times that prisoners in Hanoi were taken out before the media, and they didn't look very good. It's a tough experience. My heart goes out to him. I wanted him home. I didn't want to risk the lives and don't want to risk the lives of Americans. I would never agree with that. You know this line we have about the sailor falling off the ship? Look, the captain of the ship's responsibility is to make sure that they win the battle and first take care of everybody, and then you take care of those who are left behind. This battle is still going on. The president may be leaving, but the Taliban aren't.
Senator John McCain, Republican, Arizona, Senate Armed Services Committee, former Vietnam POW. We thank you for your expertise, your thoughts, and of course, as always, we thank you for your service, sir.
Thank you, Jake.
We're going to stay on our world lead. They are explosive allegations, to say the least, made on this very show this week that Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl may have been actively seeking a dialogue with the Taliban before his capture. Former Army Sergeant Evan Buetow, who was Bergdahl's team leader, first told this show earlier this week that his squad found out about Bergdahl's desire to talk to the enemy through radio interceptions.
I was standing right next to the radio when they heard that there's an American in a village called Yayakale. He's looking for someone who speaks English so he can talk to the Taliban. And I heard it straight from the interpreter's lips as he heard it over the radio.
Buetow's claims were then backed up on the lead by the man who led Bergdahl's squad, former Army Staff Sergeant Justin Gurley.
So I was standing there with Evan when those communications came across. As far as what exactly was said, I don't want to really say, quote it, but there was talk that he was running around looking for people to speak English and wanted to seek out the Taliban.
Could that person have been someone else, someone other than Bergdahl? Well, Gurley says no, there was no one else to meet that description. There is a similar report in the Army war logs leaked to WikiLeaks. Here's part of that. Quote, traffic indicates that an American soldier is talking and is looking for someone who speaks English, unquote. The war log, however, mentions nothing about the soldier seeking the Taliban, though the war logs are not 100% comprehensive. Buetow says the war log left that out. It was incomplete for whatever reason, and he and others reported the information to higher-ups and to investigators. So if Bergdahl really was trying to communicate with the Taliban, does that mean he had, necessarily, some kind of nefarious intent? Well, no, according to one former government official involved in the case, who says the account of Buetow and Gurley, quote, tracks with other indicators of a sort of messianic mission on Bergdahl's part to stop the violence and perhaps help broker an understanding with the local Taliban, end quote. Just one form of speculation. None of that is to necessarily excuse anything, but Bergdahl's intent is certainly significant. I want to get some more insight into the mental state of Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl with former Navy psychiatrist Dr. Paul Reagan, who's helped countless veterans. Dr. Reagan, thanks for joining us. This idea that Bergdahl may have been reaching out to make peace, you were involved in a case in 1983 with some parallels to that. Describe it for us.
Yeah, there are some interesting parallels. This was a young man, not that much younger than Sergeant Bergdahl, who left his post in Japan. He was a tank officer, flew with his own money to Pakistan, made it to northern Pakistan, and was heading there in an effort, in a delusion that he had, a grandiose delusion, that he was going to help unite the Afghan rebels in their fight against the Russians. He fortunately did not do that and ended up back in Washington, D.C., and I examined him at the National Naval Medical Center. And you talk about the Messiah complex and bipolar, which is what this young man suffered from. Bipolar disorder with a manic, grandiose delusion are one of the underpinnings that sometimes can cause this Messiah complex. Other things can be schizophrenia, certain personality, narcissistic personality traits. So there are a variety of different things that can cause this.
And Dr. Reagan, would that square it all with what we're hearing now from this local Afghan official about Bergdahl appearing to be in some sort of hallucinogenic state when he came into the village of Yayakil?
Well, what's interesting there is that if a very highly, somebody who had a lot of thoughts about joining the Army and had thought that he maybe was being called to a higher power, for him to leave and look for somebody certainly is somebody who may have had a messiah complex. The idea that the hallucinogens I can't put together. Certainly people who have suffered trauma can be very detached and look detached from their environment. That's a peculiar description, and I don't think we have enough facts to really put that in its context yet.
Let's turn to Bergdahl's current mental state. 3 days ago,
Yes.
a senior defense official confirmed to CNN that Bergdahl was having trouble speaking English after being 5 years in captivity. Today, a Pentagon spokesman says he's conversing in English.
Yes.
What's happening to him right now?
Well, I think that clearly we don't know what those 5 years were like. He was really the subject of coercion. He was very isolated. So this is an individual who's in a very fragile state, very regressed. Regressed would suggest assuming a more immature, reverting to a more immature psychological state. Now, I don't think to the point that he couldn't speak English, but he may have had some issues with word retrieval. People who are very discontrolled, very emotionally fragile, have lost their ability to modulate their own emotions, then emotions can flood and they can have impaired cognition. Also, as you yourself know, that's a very stark environment over there, and to come back, there's going to be going from sensory underload to sensory overload.
Yeah. In a situation like this, Doctor, quickly if you could,
yes.
When do you decide, when does the medical practitioner or the Army decide to reintroduce someone like this to his family?
Well, that's a clinical judgment. Everybody who is and clearly the Army is very good at this, who they're reintegrating, decompressing, progresses at a different rate, and so the clinicians on hand can make the decision when he can tolerate that.
Dr. Paul Reagan, thank you so much. We
Thank you.
appreciate it. When we come back, 13 deaths